All right, this is Unit 8, Ecology, doing an AP Bio review. My name is Mr. Chipman. I am the AP Biology and Honors Biology teacher at Murray High School in Murray, Kentucky. And we're going to review this whole unit in this video. Unit 8 is sometimes kind of a bookend to the year. Sometimes it's given as independent study. There's lots of ways that Unit 8 is given, so hopefully this will help you kind of tie everything together and finish the year strong as you prepare for the exam. Speaking of preparation for the exam, I have lots of review videos on this channel. You should check them out. Comprehensive videos for each of the units. Some of the units I've broken down into several videos. I have review videos on how to do some of the calculations. It's all there. Check it out. Thanks for that. Let's move on. Unit 8. Here we go. So it's very closely tied to Unit 7 because the way that organisms interact with their environment directly affects those organisms, right? And so, and ecology is the study of environments and how organisms that live in those environments interact with them. It's this whole big kind of thing. And so organisms over time have to change to how they respond to their environment. As their environment changes, they also have to change. If they don't, well, they don't do well. Their fitness lowers, and this is not good, right? And so that's the whole idea here behind this picture. You got some bears digging in dumpsters. Dumpsters have not been around a very long time, honestly. And bears have been around a long time. And so bears have adapted to the fact that dumpsters are these places where you can just find a whole lot of food. A whole lot of food, right? And so everything about a bear is about capturing food, getting food, finding food, and the dumpster is where they're going to find it. Well, where do you find dumpsters? In a high quantity cities where people are. And so this has caused some bad interactions as bears have become repopulated because of conservation efforts, which is a good thing. We're finding more and more human-bear interactions. This is just an example of how a bear has responded, how bears have responded to their environment. And so let's look at that. A couple more things. Well, one response is communication. Part of the environment, of course, is other organisms and how those organisms respond to one another. They have communicated with one another. There are lots and lots of forms of communication. This could be verbal, and when I mean verbal, like just noises, like audible. Could be body language type things. Could be tactile, like you see here. The baby polar bear interacting with, I'm assuming that's its mother. That's a really small baby. I guess I didn't. It doesn't even look like it's standing on the ice either. I assume that's a real picture. It looks kind of fun though. But this is all communication, right? The mother will communicate with the baby bear as well. And this is going to increase the fitness of not only the mother, but also the infant, right? This is part of the whole thing. Reproductive success is a part of fitness, and communication is going to be a part of reproductive success. Communication can be lots of different realms too, so don't think of it as like bears communicating with bears, but it could be one organism communicating with another organism. It could be a way to warn one another. It could be to warn would-be predators, stay away from me, I'm bad. You know, that anything like that is going to be communication, and those have evolved in order to adapt to their changing environment. That brings us to this. All of these are behaviors. Any kind of communicative active or action is going to be a behavior, and behaviors are innate or learned. An innate behavior is something that an organism is born with. Why are they born with that behavior? Because it's written on their DNA. You do not have to teach a baby duck to follow its mother around. Why? Well, that increases that duck's survival. Baby ducks that just kind of do their own thing get eaten pretty quickly. A baby duck that's able to run around with the mother duck knows how not to get eaten, obviously, because, well, she's still alive. And so that's going to increase their fitness. Well, a duck learning to do something is not going to be passed down. I tell this story in my classroom a lot, but I saw a duck one time, like take a piece of bread and then take it and fly it over to the other side of the pond. Well, what it was doing is it was actually using that piece of bread in order to fish. That's a learned behavior. That's not passed down from one generation to the next, right? But ducks following one another around, these are innate behaviors. Those innate behaviors are coded for in the DNA because long patterns of success and fitness have led to that. Mutations obviously are going to lead to those changes in the DNA. But I think that's the big thing. It's innate behaviors coded for in the DNA, learned behaviors not. But the ability to learn is something that's coded for in the DNA. So make sure that you make that distinction when you're talking about those two things. All right, sharp break here. Energy flow in ecosystems. Energy in ecosystems all comes from the sun. Now, there are ecosystems that exist where there is no sun, like deep ocean and caves and whatnot. But ultimately, that energy is also from the sun, right? That energy is ultimately from the sun. Now, you could argue, well, geothermal or what, I don't know, whatever. The point is that there's input energy from the sun. There are organisms in the ecosystem that are able to then take that energy and make food out of it. These are called producers. Most of the time, this is going to be plants through the process of photosynthesis. But there are other organisms that do photosynthesis, and there are other types of producers that don't do photosynthesis, right? And so be ready for that kind of interaction. Don't just think producers are plants, right? Producers are making food using energy from the ecosystem. Typically, that's going to be the sun, but in something like a deep sea vent or something like that, that's going to be something called chemosynthesis. It's going to be in the prompt if you need to know it, right? So these are producers. They're making food. Food equals glucose in this case. And then you have consumers that are eating either those producers or they're eating other consumers. The plants or the producers are typically called autotrophs, which are self-feeders. The consumers are typically called heterotrophs, which are feeding on other things. And then you have decomposers. Decomposers are returning all of those nutrients back to the ecosystem, right? Like Mufasa taught us years ago, the lion becomes the grass. How is that even possible? Well, because decomposers are breaking down the line so that the grass can take up those nutrients and become more grass. That's the whole idea here, right? And so make sure that you understand that energy. Now, I believe I have a picture. I don't actually, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this so that we make sure that those energy exchanges are not perfect, right? There's going to be loss in those energy exchanges. And so some of that's going to be loss as heat. We understand that because of the second law of thermodynamics, which says entropy increases with every single interaction, right? Now, the mouse, for instance, eats the grass. The grass has gotten all this energy from the sun. Of course, the grass is not going to give up all the energy from the sun because it's going to use some of that to grow itself, to reproduce. It's going to have some waste. Of course, it's going to lose some as heat. And so we call it the rule of 10%, whereas the next trophic level or the next level of eating is going to only get 10% of the energy available from that previous one. The rest of that 90% is going to be used for homeostasis. It's going to be used for everyday living. It's going to be used or lost as waste or lost as heat. Let's talk about metabolic strategies, right? So energy is going to be working through those ecosystems. And if you're an eagle, you've got to figure out a way to do metabolism pretty good because, well, there's not a lot of energy by the time it gets to the eagle, right? Because there's probably a snake that ate that mouse, and there's probably an eagle that's eating that snake. And so there's a lot of energy exchanges. There's a lot of 90% reductions between grass and the eagle. So there has to be some sort of metabolic strategy in order to conserve energy for the long term. There's lizards here. The way they do this is their blood is directly, or the temperature of their bodies is directly determined by their behavior. This lizard's choosing to warm up, so it's going to go get on a rock and warm up. If it chooses to cool down, it has to get under that rock. There's actually whole ecosystems where lizards are fighting for the tops of rocks. It's kind of fascinating to watch. They're just warming their bodies up. This is a metabolic strategy. They're not having to use any kind of internal mechanism in order to do that. They're just using energy from the sun. Of course, this is risky because the sun may not be out that day. So you just don't get to warm up sometimes. But they typically hibernate during those times. Other organisms like ourselves, birds, other mammals, we have endothermic systems where our metabolism and our brains kind of work together through a process of homeostasis in order to maintain a normal temperature for our bodies. This is going to come at a cost, right? It's going to come at a metabolic cost, but it's also going to have benefits associated with that. And so those are a couple metabolic strategies. Make sure you understand the kind of the risk-reward thing associated with that. And metabolism is related to size. This kind of goes into the same idea. So you have a mouse. That's not a mouse. Wow. So yeah, not everything you see on the internet is true. Thankfully, they got collie, human, horse, and elephant correct, but rabbit and mouse, are not. So it's just crazy. So the metabolic rate is on the y-axis, the mass is on the x-axis, and you can see that their relationship there. As mass increases, metabolic rate is going to decrease. As a general rule, there's some exceptions to this. So the mouse there, I'm looking at the word mouse, looking at the picture, but not whatever. Okay, so the mouse has a really high metabolism. How do they get away with this? They're really small, right? If the mouse was the size of the elephant, it would explode. It would just be this massive, like, nuclear generator. If the elephant was the size of the mouse, it would freeze to death because all of its internal mechanisms are about keeping things nice and slow. They're so big, they've got so many cells, they run a risk of overheating. And so most of their body systems are about keeping their metabolism slow so they don't overheat. Right? They sleep a lot, they stand around a lot. They have to eat a lot in order to maintain that, but a mouse is pretty much eating nonstop. Right? And what's going to happen as a result of this? Well, they have really fast metabolism, they have really fast heartbeat. Right? And their heartbeats are they're going to beat so many times in their life. The elephant's is probably going to beat about the same number of times in its life too. So it's just going to be a lot slower. The elephant's going to live a lot longer. So these are a couple things to consider. Great video, by the way. I'll throw it out there. There's this YouTube channel called Kurt Kazat. You've probably heard of it. It's got some cool animations. Just look up cell size, Kurt Kazat. You'll find it's really good on explaining this whole concept. Fantastic. What about energy availability and population size? Well, if there's more energy available, then you can expect population sizes to grow. We've seen this in our own population as over the years we have figured out how to make more energy available for our populations. And what has populations done? They've grown. Human populations have grown exponentially because of this, because we have grocery stores now. We have farming. We have industry. We have all these things. Polar bears haven't been so lucky, right? That polar bear looks like it's eating a dead leaf. I don't know what that is, actually. Polar bears can't sustain on dead leaves, right? And so as energy availability is going to, as it decreases, population size is going to decrease. This is also why polar regions, desert regions have less biodiversity, because there's less energy available, right? And you may be like, well, the desert's got all kinds of sun. They just don't have all kinds of producers because they don't have any kind of precipitation, right? And so all that kind of works together. Where you have sun and precipitation, you have tons of production. Think rainforest. Where you have sun and no precipitation, you have almost no production. Think desert. And where you have a little bit of both, kind of like a temperate zone like us, you're going to have a ton of production again. So those two things are going to be really important. And where you have a ton of production, you're going to have big population sizes, lots of biodiversity. Where you have very little production, you're going to have very little biodiversity. Little population size, which brings us to this idea of population ecology. There's basically two kind of growth models here. There's exponential growth, essentially where the population is doubling each year. Why is it doing that? Well, there's no limitations. There's no limitations on a population that is growing like you see on the left-hand side, or they've eliminated their limitations somehow like we have, right? Or that's just a typical growth model, like bacteria. They grow that way. Most organisms are going to grow in kind of this logistic growth that you see there on the right, where they're going to grow exponentially for a time and then kind of approach this area where they're going to tend to level off. That leveling off has to do with the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the amount of organisms that an ecosystem can sustain. It's going to be dependent on the ecosystem. It's going to be dependent on the organism to some degree. But most organisms, remember, that natural selection idea, that principle, that things can overproduce, right? And so as you reach that level of overproduction, of course, near the carrying capacity, the only ones that are going to survive are the fittest. And so you have this, it's a good thing for populations to kind of be limited in that way. You're going to see a lot of graphs like that. Right, you could see like a boom-bust cycle with predator-prey. There's several that you could look at that are going to test that same idea. So encourage you to make sure that you line up population growth with fitness, with natural selection, with the idea that those who are strongest are going to survive, as opposed to exponential growth where it's kind of it doesn't matter because there's no resource limitations, there's no natural selection, and therefore there's no limits on growth. Right, that brings us to these growth rate sorts of things here. All right, so yeah, you've seen these equations. None of this is hard, right? I think we make much of this sort of thing. The dN over dt, I don't know why they chose the little D as opposed to the symbol delta, which would just make so much more sense. This is the rate. Typically, you're going to be solving for rate, right? And this dn over dt is one number. So don't think of it as like I'm looking for the year or I'm looking for the d over n or dn or anything like that. You're typically going to be looking for rate as one number. And you're going to be given something like birth rate and death rate. Well, if one is born per year and one dies per year, then the growth rate is 0, right? 0 per year. And so that's the idea, very simple. Well, an exponential growth rate there is this concept of R max, which is the maximum per capita growth rate of a population. The maximum ability, that population's maximum ability to grow, multiply that times the actual population size, and then you're going to have your exponential growth rate. This is something completely different. And then logistic growth rate is when you're going to be given a carrying capacity. Now, I want to be careful here. There's a problem on AP Classroom that made me think of this. It gives you carrying capacity, it gives you all this stuff, and then it asks you to calculate the rate. It doesn't ask you to calculate the logistic growth rate, right? If it does that, then you're going to put the carrying capacity into your equation. You're going to figure it out like that. Otherwise, it's literally just change in population over change in time. That's it. If a population changes by 300 in 1 year, the rate is 300. That's it. Don't worry about carrying capacity. All that's going to be extra. AP loves to give you extra information. And so before you start doing your calculations, make sure that check yourself, ask yourself, what is this asking me to give? If it's asking for logistic growth rate, then you plug your carrying capacity in, you do all the things there. You're typically going to be asked to solve for rate. I have seen it where you can estimate population size based on R max and rate of growth. But at the end of the day, it's just solving for X. It's just basic algebra, so don't get tricked by these things. Pretty simple problems. All right, density independent, density dependent factors. These are factors that are going to limit population growth. Density dependent factors are going to be biotic factors, predation, disease, competition, resources, all that kind of stuff is going to be under density dependent factors. They're called density dependent because they are directly related to population density. Disease, great example. If a city is very dense, that disease is going to affect that city differently than if it's going to affect a more rural area like where I live, in the middle of nowhere, right? And so versus a density independent factor, which is going to be an abiotic factor. Drought's a good example. You see it on the picture. Forest fire, flood, any of those things. It doesn't matter what the population density is. It's going to affect those populations equally because it's going to kind of broad brush them, right? The drought doesn't care. Doesn't care who lives there and how many there are. It just happens, right? As opposed to having a population density, it's going to be affected directly by those factors, which is going to affect these growth rates, right? So your carrying capacity is going to be directly affected by those factors that are density independent or density dependent. Make sure you make those connections. Community ecology, typically represented by a food web. I love the pictures of food webs on the internet because they suggest to me that giant eagles are carrying away cheetahs and eating them. I guess the cheetah cubs could be eaten. And in what ecosystem is I guess are there foxes in this? I don't know. The food webs are really funny. Food web is just all the interactions in the community. You're going to see a lot of things. You're going to see a food web, and it's going to be one of those. For the next 5 questions, use the above picture, and it's going to be giant eagles eating cheetahs and snakes, right? And so you have to think through that. Obviously, it's not going to ask you who's eating the fox. Apparently, snakes eat foxes in some places. Big old snakes. Not bigger than the eagle, of course. It's able to carry them all the way. I love the two-tone mane of the lion there, too. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. Giant lions eat rhinos. Yeah. Okay, so Simpson's diversity index. This is one of those kind of problems that I don't think I've ever actually seen on the exam. I could be corrected. But it's very simple, right? I'll just walk you through the problem. If you want to pause and solve this, that's fine. I'm not going to solve it. But this is the kind of thing that you might see where you have ecosystem A and ecosystem B, and the question could be which one of these has a higher diversity index. And the way that you do that is you have N over N. And little n is the total number of organisms of a particular species. So take rhinos in ecosystem A, that'd be 4. And you divide that total number of organisms in all species, and what is it? It's I don't know, a lot. They're on the they're on the left. Let's see, it's 8, 12, 17 total. So you have 4 divided by 17, and you're going to square that, and that's one number, right? So you do that for rhinos, eagles, monkeys, zebras. You add all those together. That's what the sigma is. You subtract that from 1, and then you have your systems diversity index. A higher systems diversity index means there's more diversity in that particular ecosystem. If it's lower, then it's lower diversity. All right, so the question may be compare ecosystems A and B and which one has more diversity. I haven't seen that. It's a lot to invest in one question. And I would even encourage, that if you see a question like that where you have something like this, it's literally going to take you like 4 or 5 minutes to solve, maybe mark it, come back and do it after the time has elapsed, or not after the time has elapsed, but after you finish the rest of the exam. Because you don't want to get stuck on a problem like this for that one point. Right. You don't want to sacrifice other points for this one. If it's in an FRQ, obviously you're going to be looking at it a little bit differently, but I haven't seen it. All right, biodiversity. Biodiversity has to do with the number of different organisms, could be the number of different ecosystems, could be the amount of genes in a particular population, like genetic diversity, could mean lots of things. But anytime you see that diversity, you're thinking about different things. Biodiversity, obviously, like different kinds of life. And anytime you have an increase of this, it's always going to be good for an ecosystem. More biodiversity is always more better. All right, so, and then you have this idea of keystone species. Keystone species is usually the key to biodiversity, meaning that if this species were to be taken away, it could disrupt the whole fabric of the ecosystem. Wolves are used a lot for this particular idea, right? And the idea is if you take wolves out of here, then apparently the bat population, why? Are wolves eating bats? They're definitely eating bison and that ram. They're probably not eating the hawk, right? But the idea here in this picture is to show you that the wolves are so important in this particular ecosystem that when you remove them, the ecosystem kind of falls apart, right? Even down to the producer level. Fascinating stuff that's been done on the Yellowstone wolves, and you've probably seen them, I'm sure, in middle school when you were watching a lot of videos at the end of the year. You probably saw the whole like wolves of Yellowstone. They changed the rivers. If you haven't seen that, just look it up. Wolves change rivers, YouTube. It's like a 7-minute video. It's fascinating. Really gives you this idea of what it means that there's a keystone species that literally affects the whole ecosystem. Good ideas. Finally, lastly, disruptions to ecosystems. I love this picture. You've learned about primary and secondary succession, I'm sure. Primary succession starting over at rocks, secondary succession starting over at soil. And what do we mean by starting over? Well, they had to start over because there's some kind of disruption, right? There was some sort of disruption in the ecosystem that caused that ecosystem to have to shift. As the environment shifts, the animals and the organisms that live in it also have to shift. If they don't, they die, right? The earth is constantly changing. That's the idea, right? Is to make sure that you connect this to the idea that we started with, really, is that as ecosystems change, the organisms that live in it have to change as well. The earth is this changing place. And then we introduce change in it, particularly as humans, as we have all this stuff that's going on, habitat reduction, pollution, just general consumption of resources. There's all these things that we do. Agriculture is another good one that we do to ecosystems that change them. Some organisms are adapting really well. Others, well, not so much, right? And so you have this like extinction that's coming in there, which could go back to this, right? Wolves are a great example. The reason that wolves were out of the ecosystem for so long is because of rifles. We stopped shooting them, they came back. Well, now we have this real problem because we've built farms, and wolves like things that live on farms. So we have these interactions that we have to deal with, right? That cause disruption to the ecosystem. So make sure that you understand this is all tied together. Ecology, evolution in particular, very closely linked concepts and very closely linked ideas that you will regularly have to talk about particularly as you're working through those FRQ problems that you're regularly going to have to refer to, right? The idea that the ecosystem changes, therefore the organisms that live on it change or they die, and being able to talk about that and have, just being able to use those words. It's a good thing. Hopefully this review was helpful. Hopefully you will do well on the test. Let me know down below how things go for you. Talk to you later.